It began with mud, and an idea so large it sounded like madness. In the winter of 1941, before the snow had melted on the fields of Ypsilanti, Michigan, men in overcoats stood ankle-deep in frozen muck, staring at a stretch of empty farmland. Wind whipped across the open plain. There was nothing here, no roads, no buildings, no reason to believe this wasteland would soon give birth to the largest factory in the world. And yet Henry Ford, 78 years old, stood there with a glint in his eye and said quietly, "We'll build it here." The generals from Washington tried not to laugh. They had come in polished boots and long coats, looking more like skeptics than believers. One of them finally spoke. "You can't mass-produce bombers like you make Model Ts," he said. "Airplanes are too complex, too delicate." Ford didn't argue. He simply smiled. "Watch me." It was the beginning of the Willow Run project, a promise to build one B-24 Liberator bomber every hour. No one had ever attempted anything like it. The country had been at war for only a few months, still reeling from Pearl Harbor. Factories were converting from cars to tanks, typewriters to rifles, sewing machines to machine guns. But a bomber, a four-engine giant made of more than 1 million parts, that was something different. Even within Ford Motor Company, many thought it was suicide. The old man had ideas. His son Edsel, younger, softer-spoken, had to make them real. Together, they faced the impossible, turning the principles of car manufacturing into the machinery of war. In early meetings, the tension was thick. Ford engineers argued with Air Corps officials over tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. The military men called it airplane magic. Ford called it engineering discipline. "We'll do it the Ford way," he said. "On the line, step by step, until the sky runs out of space." Blueprints spread across tables like battle plans. The scale was breathtaking, a building 1.25 miles long, with assembly lines so vast they would curve with the Earth's shape. A single roof covering 3.5 million square feet, enough space for 300 football fields. But first, there was the land, soggy, uneven, and cursed with the kind of Michigan weather that could freeze steel. Bulldozers sank into the mud. Concrete trucks got stuck. For weeks, nothing moved but the wind. Workers cursed, engineers despaired, and headlines mocked the dream. "Ford's folly," one paper sneered. Inside the Ford offices, Edsel read the headlines in silence. He was sickly by then, overworked, and already dying slowly from stomach ulcers that no doctor could cure. But he refused to quit. "If we stop now," he told his team, "we lose more than a factory. We lose faith." Every week, trainloads of steel arrived from Detroit. Thousands of workers came, men from the auto lines, farmers from Ohio, mechanics from the South. They built in the snow, poured concrete under lanterns at midnight, hammered rivets with bare hands. By the summer of 1942, the structure rose from the plain like something out of science fiction, a silver city of glass and steel, glowing even in the rain. When the doors opened, you could hear the hum from miles away. But the first bomber that rolled out of Willow Run didn't fly. It shook, it rattled, and on its first test run, one of the wings tore loose. Reporters were merciless. Ford's flying fiasco, the Detroit Times declared. Even Henry Ford's confidence began to crack. He was old, tired, and the world he understood, the world of assembly lines and tin roofs, suddenly felt far away from the war raging across the oceans. And yet, for all its failures, Willow Run had already become something more than a factory. At night, when the lights burned across its endless windows, it looked like a beacon. Inside, thousands of men and women worked side by side, housewives, farmhands, students, building not just airplanes, but a new kind of America. It was chaos. It was hope. It was the beginning of something no one could yet name. In a quiet corner of the plant, a young welder wrote in her notebook, "We're not just building bombers. We're building a promise." But outside, the mud still clung to the boots of every worker. The barracks were freezing. The cafeterias were overcrowded. And on the edge of the airfield, where the snow mixed with oil and footprints, an engineer looked at the empty sky and whispered, "Before we can build a bomber every hour, we'll have to build a city out of mud." Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel. At night, Willow Run glowed brighter than Detroit. From the highway, it looked like a city made of light. Endless rows of windows stretching into the horizon, furnaces blazing like dawn, exhaust smoke drifting into the winter sky. It wasn't just a factory anymore. It was alive. By 1942, the mud was gone. In its place stood the largest industrial building on Earth. Inside, 24 hours a day, steel turned to flight. The air smelled of oil and hot aluminum. Sparks flew like fireflies. Overhead, cranes swung wings the size of houses. The workers called it the city of steel and sweat. They came from everywhere, from the mines of Pennsylvania, the farms of Indiana, the streets of Chicago. Trains unloaded them by the thousands, young and old, men and women. Some came chasing a paycheck. Others came chasing purpose. All of them came because Ford had promised that if America could build cars, it could build victory. But Willow Run was no easy salvation. The barracks were cold, overcrowded, and never quiet. Babies cried through the nights. Tired mothers slept in corners with lunch pails for pillows. The cafeteria lines wrapped around the building. The smell of coffee mixed with grease and exhaustion. A worker named Mary Johnson wrote in her journal, "We didn't have weekends. We had shifts. 8 hours, then 10, then 12. When you left, your hands shook from the noise. But you went back because you knew what it was for." The noise was constant, a thunder made of metal and motion. Men shouted over the roar of presses that could flatten steel with a single strike. Conveyor belts clanked, drills screamed, rivet guns cracked like machine fire. The sound never stopped, not even at midnight. They built B-24 bombers, for engines 67 feet long, 2,000 horsepower each. A miracle of engineering, but a nightmare to assemble. More than 1 million parts had to fit perfectly, and the first few didn't. The rivets failed, the engines misfired, the wings flexed like paper in the wind. The planes fell apart before they flew, one engineer admitted. The newspapers had a field day. Ford's flying fiasco, read the Detroit Free Press. "You can't mass-produce miracles," said another. But the workers kept going. Every mistake was a lesson, every crash a blueprint. Supervisors hung slogans from the rafters. Quality is your shield. Speed is your weapon. Inside the hangar doors, you could see the future forming piece by piece. Women worked side by side with men, hair tucked under scarves, coveralls smeared with oil. They drilled, welded, and riveted. Rosie the Riveter wasn't a poster here. She was real, sweating and swearing and laughing through the fatigue. There was pride in the exhaustion. They were ordinary people building something extraordinary. Still, not everything held together. In the break rooms, tempers flared. The pace was too fast, the foreman too hard. A strike nearly broke out after a week of 14-hour days. "We can't fight Hitler if we collapse first," someone shouted. Morale was slipping, and the numbers proved it. Each bomber took 55 hours to finish. The military had expected one every hour. At that rate, the war would end long before Willow Run caught up. Ford executives grew nervous. Edsel looked pale, coughing between meetings, pushing through his own illness. He sent telegrams to Washington assuring them that progress was steady, but he knew it wasn't. The plant was a masterpiece on paper and a disaster in motion. Then one night, in the deafening hum of the assembly floor, a worker noticed a man standing in the shadows, silent, arms crossed, eyes sharp. No badge, no clipboard, just watching. When someone asked who he was, the foreman whispered, "That's Charles Sorensen, Mr. Ford's old Iron Man." Sorensen had built the first moving assembly line with Henry Ford decades earlier. He'd been there when the first Model T rolled out of Highland Park. Now, he had come out of semi-retirement to see what had gone wrong. He didn't speak to the workers. He didn't need to. He walked the line, step by step, eyes following the chaos, half-finished wings, misplaced tools, men waiting for parts that never came. And when he reached the end of the hangar, where a half-built bomber sat glistening under floodlights, Sorensen turned and said just 4 words. "We'll tear it down." The managers froze. "Tear down what?" He pointed across the hangar, the entire line. "All of it." Gasps, shouting, disbelief. But Sorensen wasn't asking. He was already pulling blueprints from his coat. "Start over," he said. "If we can build cars in 90 seconds, we can build a bomber in 60 minutes. His voice was calm, but it carried the certainty of a man who had built America's future once and intended to do it again. By morning, the workers were tearing out equipment, moving stations, rebuilding the line from scratch. The rumor spread like wildfire. Ford's Iron Man was back, and he was going to make the impossible work. Outside, the smokestacks kept burning. Inside, something new was taking shape, not just another experiment, but a revolution. When Charles Sorensen walked into Willow Run, he didn't talk. He just watched and saw what everyone else had missed. He was a hard man to read, square-shouldered, in his mid-60s, with a jaw like the front of a press brake and eyes that gave nothing away. He had been with Henry Ford since the beginning, back when the world still doubted machines could replace muscle. They called him Cast Iron Charlie, part engineer, part drill sergeant, and completely intolerant of excuses. Now he stood in the middle of the largest factory on Earth, and all he saw was chaos. On paper, Willow Run was a miracle. In reality, it was a storm of inefficiency. Workers waited for parts that never arrived. Engines were installed before wiring was finished. Wings were painted before the rivets were tested. Every process tripped over the next. Sorensen watched for 2 hours without saying a word. Then he called the supervisors together and said simply, "Tear it down." They stared at him, unsure whether they had heard correctly. "All of it," he repeated. "This isn't a factory. It's a guessing game." And just like that, the man they called the architect of mass production began dismantling the heart of the Ford war machine. For weeks, the plant became a battlefield of blueprints. Sorensen redrew everything: the layout, the timing, the workflow. He made each step feed the next like a living organism. Rivets moved in trays, not buckets. Assemblers worked in sequence, not clusters. The process became music, measured in seconds instead of hours. He slept in his office, ate sandwiches at his desk, and roamed the floor at night with a stopwatch in his hand. Workers began to notice that if Cast Iron Charlie stopped beside you, you were either about to be fired or become part of something extraordinary. A mechanic remembered. He never raised his voice. He didn't have to. You could feel the clock ticking inside him. By the spring of 1943, the rhythm had changed. Parts arrived like clockwork. The noise became a kind of language. Engines rolled down the line, wings attached with mathematical precision. And then, one morning, something happened that no one thought possible. A complete B-24 Liberator rolled out of Willow Run in just 63 minutes. The news spread through the plant like wildfire. Men cheered, women cried, and Sorensen, standing in the corner, just nodded once and said, "Again." He turned mass production into choreography. Instead of building one plane at a time, each section, the nose, the fuselage, the tail, the wings, moved through its own mini-factory, meeting at the final line like pieces of a puzzle. To make it work, he even invented a new way of moving the planes, towing them sideways through the building, so every inch of the mile-long line stayed in motion. When reporters came, they described it as industrial magic. But Sorensen knew better. It wasn't magic. It was sweat, order, and discipline. By August 1943, Willow Run reached the goal no one believed possible: one bomber every hour. Every 60 minutes, another silver bird emerged from the hangar and rose into the Michigan sky. The Army called it the most extraordinary manufacturing feat of the war. But the cost was measured not just in steel, it was in people. 12-hour shifts became routine. The roar never stopped. Some workers collapsed at their stations. The factory cafeteria served 30,000 meals a day. When the whistle blew, no one even heard it anymore. It had become part of the heartbeat. A woman named Dorothy Miller wrote to her husband overseas, "They say we're safe here, but this feels like another kind of front. The lights never go out. The air tastes like metal." Still, the bombers flew, thousands of them. They crossed the Atlantic in convoys, their shadows falling across the same oceans where American sons were dying. Inside Ford headquarters, Edsel watched the production numbers rise, 500, 1,000, 2,000, and smiled faintly. But his body was failing. Doctors warned him to rest. He refused. "Not while we're still behind," he said. When the 5,000th bomber rolled off the line, Sorensen stood beside the runway, hands in his coat pockets. The engines thundered, wheels lifted, and the Liberator climbed into the sky like a silver promise. For a moment, even he allowed himself a rare smile. Then he turned to his foreman and said, "Good. Now keep it up." But behind that success, something darker was building: fatigue, illness, and pressure that no machine could bear forever. Ford's miracle was running at full speed, but the people inside it were starting to crack. As Sorensen left the hangar that night, he looked down the long, glowing corridor of Willow Run, a mile of light and motion, and muttered to himself, "We've beaten time. Now let's see if we can survive it." Every hour, a new bomber. Every hour, someone collapsed. By the summer of 1943, Willow Run had found its rhythm. It was the rhythm of war, relentless, mechanical, unstoppable. Inside the hangars, the air shimmered with heat. The smell of oil and sweat mixed with metal dust until you could taste it on your tongue. The sound never ended. Hammers, drills, rivet guns, engines running on test stands, voices shouting over the thunder. It was a world without silence. The shift sirens howled every 4 hours. Men and women moved in streams through the long corridors, faces gray with fatigue, hands calloused and blackened by grease. Even in the break rooms, the vibration of the factory floor could be felt through the soles of their shoes. A worker joked once, "We don't make planes anymore. We make time." Everyone laughed, but the laughter didn't last. They were exhausted. People fell asleep, standing up, fainted beside the lines. A nurse's log from the Ford Medical Unit listed 47 cases of heat exhaustion in a single week. Some workers kept bottles of salt water to fight dehydration. Others simply pushed through. There was no other choice. Mary Johnson, the riveter who once wrote that she could hear the machines in her dreams, made another note that summer. "I can still hear the engines in my sleep. Sometimes I wake up thinking I'm inside one." Yet for every worker who collapsed, another took their place. The war didn't wait for anyone. The orders kept coming, 650 planes a month. Each one a silver, screaming promise headed for the sky. Outside, in the Michigan sun, the completed B-24s stood in perfect rows. They called them Liberators. Sleek, heavy, brutal. For engines each, capable of carrying 5 tons of bombs. They looked invincible, and for a moment, the workers who built them felt that way too. But the truth was simpler. They were tired. Terribly, endlessly tired. Some nights, when the shift ended, they sat by the airfield and watched the bombers take off. The lights of the runway stretched into the dark like a path to another world. As the engines roared, a few waved, not at the planes, but at the thought that something they'd touched would soon cross the ocean and fight for them. In Europe, those same bombers were changing the war. Crews who flew them nicknamed Willow Run, the heartbeat of freedom. In letters home, pilots wrote, "Tell the folks in Michigan, your planes are saving lives out here." Those letters were pinned to the factory walls. Workers read them during breaks, hands still trembling from the vibrations of their tools. For a few minutes, the fatigue lifted. The noise became music again, the rhythm of purpose. But it couldn't last forever. The human body wasn't made for 12-hour shifts, 7 days a week. Accidents increased. Rivets misfired, parts jammed, tempers broke. Fights erupted in the cafeteria. Supervisors began keeping a quiet tally of those who didn't return. Men who simply walked out one day and never came back. Still, the numbers kept climbing. Productivity rose 12-fold from the year before. The War Department called it a miracle of modern industry. The newspapers echoed the praise. But no one outside Willow Run saw the cost. One night, as the third shift dragged into its 10th hour, an engine test detonated without warning. A flash of blue fire, a roar like thunder, and for a moment everything froze. When the smoke cleared, a mechanic lay motionless beside the wreckage. Someone whispered, "He was supposed to be off 2 hours ago." No one said anything after that. The next morning, the line started again. In the cafeteria, a chalkboard displayed the slogan, "Keep them flying." Below it, someone had scrawled in pencil, "But who keeps us flying?" The managers wiped it clean by noon. Still, there was something unbreakable in the people of Willow Run. They kept showing up, even when their hands bled through their gloves, even when their eyes stung from exhaustion. They weren't heroes, not in the way soldiers were, but they fought their own kind of war, against fatigue, against failure, against time itself. Charles Sorensen knew it too. He walked the factory floor like a ghost commander, stopwatch in hand, eyes sharp but tired. The rhythm he had created, the perfect machine of production, was now consuming its creators. "This isn't just production anymore," he said quietly to one of his foremen. "This is endurance." And he was right. The lines never stopped. Every hour, another bomber rose from the floor. Every hour, another worker fell behind it, to rest, to sickness, sometimes forever. But the war in Europe was turning. The bombers they built were now striking deep into Germany. For the first time, victory felt possible. And yet, deep inside Willow Run, amid the glow of furnaces and the thunder of engines, another truth was forming. That for every liberator taking off into the dawn, someone down below was falling apart. We were winning the war, but losing ourselves. By the winter of 1944, Willow Run had become a world unto itself, a city of motion that never slept. The snow outside fell in silence, but inside, the factory still roared like a living thing. Rivet guns cracked, presses thundered, and the smell of oil and aluminum hung so thick you could taste it in the air. The posters said, "Keep them flying," but the people on the line were barely standing. Mary Johnson, the riveter who once joked that she could hear the engines in her dreams, now worked with her wrists wrapped in cloth. "We had no time for bandages," she said later. "You wrapped it. You worked. You prayed you'd last till Sunday." Most didn't even get that far. The 12-hour shifts had turned into 14. The hospital unit, a converted storage wing, overflowed with workers fainting from exhaustion. The factory physician's report read, "They work like soldiers and fall like them too." And still, the orders came. The War Department wanted 650 planes a month. No excuses. Ford executives pushed harder. Production goals were posted on giant boards at the end of each line. Every delay, every missed rivet, every broken drill bit was a failure not just of skill, but of patriotism. "We weren't allowed to slow down," recalled one mechanic. If a man passed out, they carried him off and kept the line running. Outside the plant, Michigan froze under snow. Inside, the heat from the machinery made the walls drip with condensation. Steam rose from the floors. You couldn't tell if it was sweat or fog. And yet, the bombers kept coming. One every hour. Each one a shining symbol of American will. The newspapers called it Ford's Miracle of the Skies. Reporters visited the plant, taking photos of smiling women and men in goggles and gloves. The headlines read, "The arsenal of democracy never sleeps." No one printed the photos of the ones who didn't wake up. Dorothy Miller, who worked on the tail section line, wrote in a letter to her husband overseas, "They say our planes are winning the war. But every time one takes off, I wonder if I'll ever stop hearing the sound." The sound, that endless mechanical heartbeat, had become part of them. It followed them home, into the kitchens, the beds, the dreams. Some workers swore they could hear the echo of engines, even in silence. The fatigue became something deeper, a kind of numbness. The laughter faded, the song stopped. People stopped talking during breaks. They simply sat, staring at the floor, waiting for the next siren to call them back. A new term appeared in the medical records, production fatigue. It was a polite way to describe what was really happening, minds breaking under pressure, bodies refusing to move. Yet the numbers told another story. Willow Run had never been stronger. In April 1944, it hit its all-time peak, 650 bombers in a single month. 12 times the output of its first year. For Edsel Ford, it was both triumph and torment. His health was failing, his lungs weakened by illness. But he kept working, visiting the plant as often as his doctors allowed. "They need to see me," he said. "They need to know we're still fighting." When a reporter asked him how it felt to oversee the greatest factory in the world, he smiled faintly and said, "Heavy." The men and women of Willow Run understood. They were carrying something heavier than steel, the weight of time itself. Every minute counted. Every hour lost meant another squadron grounded, another mission delayed. But for all the glory, cracks were forming. The turnover rate skyrocketed. Families left the company housing, too tired to keep up. Trains full of new recruits arrived every week, their faces fresh, their eyes unready for what awaited them. Even Sorensen, Cast Iron Charlie himself, began to slow down. He'd walk the line with his stopwatch, but his steps were heavier now. He knew what the factory had become, a living machine that demanded sacrifice. One morning, after a record-breaking week, a telegram arrived from the War Department. The front in Europe had shifted. Allied bombers were now striking deep into Germany. The tide was turning. Victory in sight, the message read. Maintain maximum production. But the mood in the factory didn't lift. For the first time, Workers asked themselves what would happen when the war ended. What would they become when the noise stopped? Mary Johnson wrote one last note in her journal that winter. We built planes faster than anyone thought possible. But somewhere along the way, we forgot what it meant to stop. And then, in the spring of 1945, the telegrams began to change. Cities in Germany fell one by one. The headlines spoke of peace on the horizon. One morning, Sorensen read a single sentence from Washington and said nothing for a long time. The war was ending. The orders were slowing. And though everyone had prayed for that moment, no one at Willow Run knew what it would mean when the machines finally went quiet. The day they built their last bomber, nobody cheered. June 1945. The war in Europe was over. Flags waved across America, bells rang in small towns, and crowds filled the streets. But inside the hangars of Willow Run, there was only silence, a silence so deep it felt heavier than the roar that had filled the place for years. For the first time since 1942, the assembly lines stood still. The conveyor belts were motionless. The air, once thick with the smell of oil and hot steel, now smelled of dust. Workers moved slowly, almost reverently, around the final B-24 Liberator. Its aluminum skin gleamed under the fluorescent lights, the last of its kind. Charles Sorensen stood near the wing, hands in his pockets. He looked older, smaller somehow, as if the noise had been holding him upright all this time. For years we built for war, he murmured. Now we'll learn to build for peace. The workers didn't know whether to celebrate or mourn. Some cried. Some just stared. For months they had dreamed of this moment, the end of exhaustion, the end of endless shifts. But when it finally came, it felt like losing something they couldn't name. A woman in a blue jumpsuit traced her hand across the bomber's nose. In black paint, someone had written, "To the end of the war, and the beginning of something new." They had built 8,685 of them. 8,685 machines that had crossed oceans, flattened enemy strongholds, and helped end the bloodiest war the world had ever seen. But to the people here, each plane was more than a number. It was a piece of their lives, their sweat, their sleep, their youth. The factory whistle blew one last time. It was softer than anyone remembered, almost apologetic. No one moved for a while. Then the last bomber began to roll slowly toward the open hangar doors. Its propellers spun, its engines roared, and for a moment, the sound came back, the old heartbeat of Willow Run, one last breath before silence. As it lifted off the runway, a strange thing happened. No one clapped. They just watched, eyes wet, hands still, as the silver plane climbed into the clear Michigan sky and disappeared into the light. Sorensen turned to leave. "That's it," he said simply. "That's the last of them." Edsel Ford wasn't there to see it. He had died the year before, a quiet casualty of the same war he helped fight from home. His father, Henry, now frail and distant, had retreated into silence. The empire they had built together had carried America through its darkest hour, but even empires need rest. The next morning, the workers returned to find the lights dimmed. Some packed their tools, others just stood by the lines, unsure what to do with their hands. One foreman tried to sound cheerful. "Back to cars soon, folks. We'll be building peace now." But the words felt hollow. Peace didn't have the same rhythm. A few stayed to dismantle the giant jigs and presses. The sound of wrenches echoed through the empty hall, metallic ghosts of what once was. Piles of unused aluminum gleamed like silver bones under the factory lights. In the cafeteria, someone had written on the wall, "We beat the clock. Now the clock has stopped." For the first time in years, the night outside was quiet. No sirens, no trucks, no engines testing at dawn. Families sat together again. Children who had grown up beside the roar of the plant fell asleep in silence and woke up confused. The end of war should have felt like victory. But for those who had lived inside Willow Run's walls, it felt more like waking from a long, heavy dream. One so real that the world outside seemed distant, smaller, too slow. Some of them couldn't adjust. They missed the sound, the purpose, the urgency. They missed the faces that had stood beside them every day, hands moving in perfect rhythm. A former line worker named Joe Simmons later said, "When that last plane flew, it felt like my life went with it." You don't just stop fighting overnight. The bomber itself, the final Liberator, was ferried to storage in Kansas. It never saw combat. But those who built it said it carried something more than bombs or engines. It carried everything they'd given: years, sleep, laughter, tears, the belief that ordinary people could do the extraordinary. When Sorensen left Willow Run for the last time, he paused at the door and looked back. The mile-long building stretched into shadow, silent and still. The place that had once built time itself now felt timeless. He smiled, just barely, and whispered, "We built the impossible. That's enough." Outside, the morning light touched the runway. In the distance, the last bomber was a dot in the sky, fading but never gone. And though the war was ending, something lingered in the air at Willow Run. Not the sound of engines, but the echo of what they had meant. Years later, the old hangars still smelled of oil and hope. The war had ended, the bombers were gone, and the fields around Ypsilanti grew quiet again. The factory that once roared louder than any city now stood still, a steel monument to a moment when America had done the impossible. For a while, Willow Run was forgotten. The workers went home, the machines rusted, and weeds pushed through the cracks of the runway. The world moved on, toward cars, suburbs, televisions. But for those who had lived inside those walls, time never truly moved forward. Mary Johnson, now gray-haired and retired, came back one autumn afternoon in 1955. She parked outside the old gate, where the Ford sign had long been taken down, and walked to the fence. Through the gaps, she could still see the outline of the building, a mile of metal and memory. She whispered, "We didn't just build bombers. We built belief." And she was right. For all its noise and exhaustion, Willow Run had proven something no one had thought possible, that a free nation, fueled by ordinary people, could outbuild tyranny itself. Historians later called it the arsenal of democracy. Politicians used the phrase in speeches, students wrote it in essays, but for those who had lived it, it wasn't about slogans. It was about nights without sleep, the rhythm of hammers, and the courage to keep going when nothing felt human anymore. In 1946, parts of the factory were sold to aviation companies. The great assembly lines were dismantled, their bolts and rails scattered across Michigan. But some sections remained. Engineers used them to test new engines for the coming jet age. Others turned into storage for Cold War aircraft. The war that had ended had merely changed shape. By the 1960s, the veterans of Willow Run, the men and women who had once built bombers faster than anyone thought possible, were scattered across America. Some built cars for Ford again. Others became teachers, farmers, machinists. A few, like Sorensen, simply disappeared into history books. Yet the memory of what they had done refused to fade. Every few years, a local newspaper would run a story where the bombers once flew. And for a few days, people remembered. Then, in 1977, something extraordinary happened. The city renamed the nearby airfield Willow Run Airport. A crowd gathered under a gray sky as a restored B-24, one of the few left in the world, flew low over the field. The sound of its engines rolled through the air like thunder remembered. Some of the old workers were there. Many wept. Among them was a British pilot named Arthur Hill. He had flown a Liberator built at Willow Run in 1944, a plane that brought his crew home after being hit over Bremen. He sent a letter to the organizers of the event. It was read aloud that day. "I owe my life to the people of that factory. Tell them that the plane they built brought us home. Tell them, thank you." When the reading ended, the crowd was silent. Then came the sound of applause, soft at first, then rising like the hum of engines returning from far away. The hangars that remained were turned into museums and workshops. Volunteers, many of them children and grandchildren of the original workers, began restoring old warplanes, repainting them in the same olive and silver colors of the 1940s. One wall displayed photographs, thousands of faces, nameless but proud. A small sign under the photos read, "They built faster than they slept." In 2013, the Yankee Air Museum took over part of the original Willow Run site. The rest was scheduled for demolition, but a group of locals, mechanics, teachers, veterans, raised money to save a single section of the assembly line. They called it Saving Willow Run. They said it wasn't just about bricks or rivets. It was about remembering what people can do when they believe they have no limits. One of the campaigners, the granddaughter of a riveter, said on local radio, "My grandmother built wings here. She said they weren't for planes, they were for people. Today, the restored hangar stands like a heartbeat frozen in time. Inside, you can still see the faint yellow line that once guided the liberators toward the open doors. You can walk where 42,000 men and women once stood, shoulder to shoulder, covered in sweat and aluminum dust, making history one rivet at a time. If you stand very still, you can almost hear it, the hum that once shook the air, the thunder of the presses, the chatter, the laughter, the footsteps of a generation who believed that work itself could be an act of courage. A local guide often ends his tours with the same words. They didn't just build planes. They built a future. And every bolt they turned history, too. Because Willow Run's legacy isn't just about machines. It's about what those machines meant. About a generation that believed skill was a weapon, work was honor, and unity could change the course of war. When asked years later if she ever missed the factory, Mary Johnson smiled and said, "Sometimes. Not the noise, not the sweat, just the feeling. The feeling that what I did mattered." And that's what Willow Run gave to the world. Not just bombers, not just records, but meaning. Because in the end, it wasn't metal that won the war. It was belief. Belief hammered into steel by hands that refused to stop. Every hour, a bomber had risen from the earth. Every hour, someone had fallen to keep it flying. But long after the engine stopped, something else kept going. The idea that in the darkest times, ordinary people can rise higher than any plane. And that was Willow Run's true legacy. When the sun sets over the old runways now, the hangar windows reflect the light like wings. You can almost see them, those ghostly planes lifting off again, silent but eternal, carrying not bombs, but memories. And if you listen closely, the wind still carries a faint echo, not of war, but of work, of courage, of unity. The echo of millions of hands that believed that the impossible could, for a moment in history, be made real. They called it a factory, but what they built there was faith made visible.